So they've got memories. They remember almost everything that happened to them. They form social links with other NPCs, forming these large social networks. They have experiences. They have moods. They're governed by fundamental needs, and all of these different aspects of their cognitive model feed into their decision-making process to make them work a lot more like regular people.
I am joined by Sam Ruggieri of Voyager Games, and we are going to be talking about his game Outer Colony. So Sam, thank you for talking to us about your game.
Thanks so much for having me.
Great. So to start, why don't you give us a brief pitch for Outer Colony, what it is, and why people should be interested?
Sure. So Outer Colony is a real-time strategy game that's sort of in the colony building subgenre. But we've tried to build something that's really different from what you get out of typical RTS games that players have a lot of experience with, in that we've built Outer Colony on top of a very deep, intricate world model that tries to simulate and really emulate a real world in a low-fidelity manner, but to the greatest extent possible. And then on top of that simulation, we've built a sort of AI that models human behavior in a much deeper way than you get in a typical game. So the end result is you've got a more or less an RTS game in a deeply simulated world with entities that behave more like humans. So it allows for a lot more outside-the-box gameplay. We really wanted to provide players with an experience that was much more in line with being like a field-grade officer in the real world, where you're actually commanding people in worlds that you can change in all kind of different ways to allow for outside-the-box strategizing, just a lot of new gameplay that we're trying to push the envelope on, to provide players with something that's really new and really unique. And that's kind of what Outer Colony is in a nutshell.
Great. I think you touched on two elements that I really want to talk about in this interview, and that's the AI and the depth of information that's in Outer Colony. If you start looking at the video tutorials that you've made available online channel, you see very quickly how much Outer Colony relies on this AI. How it's all built around that. The foundation of this game is the AI. I wanted to ask you why you focused on this, what drew you to it, and why you're making a game where so many different parts reflect back and form the pillars that support this.
That's absolutely correct. Your insight serves you well. The core of the game is about facilitating the kind of AI that our NPCs have. And the origins of this really go back to many years ago, before I had started doing any sort of game development. I used to work in the defense industry. Particularly, I was on some projects that involved research into unconventional mechanisms for human behavior modeling. I got to touch a lot of world simulation stuff, DARPA-funded stuff, and it was very cool and a very interesting experience. But if you're just a rank-and-file sort of grunt software engineer working in that kind of environment, you don't really get much of an opportunity to implement your own ideas. So you might see a whole bunch of things. You might come up with ideas on your own, but you're going to be implementing whatever some PhD has written in the white paper that won the contract on the project. You don't really get to do your own thing. So I remember a few years back, I was thinking to myself, well, I've got all these ideas. There's no way for me to do it here. My two options are either go back to grad school, sit around for 4 or 5 years, get a PhD. Maybe if I know the right people, I can get contracts to do my own thing, or just go out and try to make software on my own. So that's kind of how I got into indie game development. And that's really, really the core of where some of the AI ideas were born, back doing that sort of research. And what it winds up giving you in terms of gameplay is we really wanted to make a game where the NPCs are much more like real humans. So they have this the data model that feeds what they do is comprised of all of these discrete subsystems, and I've worked on some of these sorts of things before. So they've got memories. They remember almost everything that happened to them. They form social links with other NPCs, forming these large social networks. They have experiences. They have moods. They're governed by fundamental needs, and all of these different aspects of their cognitive model feed into their decision-making process to make them work a lot more like regular people. So not only do you have to provide for them, there are a lot of games out there where you've got to feed people people, you've got to clothe them and do things like that. This really takes it to a level that's beyond that. At least from what I've seen out there in other games, in terms of trying to give them a very deep, very comprehensive model so that they're not like chess pieces that you move around on a board. Like if you're playing StarCraft or Command & Conquer, you highlight your units, you say move here, you say shoot there, and they do what you tell them to do.
Right.
In Outer Colony, it's a matter of poking and prodding the AI, molding and shaping it by forming a local culture, by having people indoctrinated in the right way to get them to comply with your directives and do the specific things you want them to do in the way that you want them to do it. So, again, it's my background that led into it, but I think that the great thing about indie game development is that it provides such a fertile venue for doing these kinds of things. You know, there aren't really many opportunities to experiment, to implement new kinds of gameplay, but the great thing about being an indie developer is you can take risks that larger organizations just fundamentally can't kind of take.
Absolutely, absolutely, spot on. I think you're spot on in saying there's a lot of depth behind AI. I mean, that's very clear. And the other thing that has a lot of depth is the world itself. In looking at this world, in interacting with it, with these colonists, there is a ton of information, and it's really impressive how deep you've put detail into this world. But I wanted to ask you about the learning curve, because I'm sure, you know, as you add more and more information into a game, it's going to become more and more things to manage, more and more things to learn, and how you've approached trying to balance that, you know, getting somebody into the game, a curve of difficulty, or if you are more committed to making a really in-depth thing that's going to take you a long time to understand, but that's the experience you want.
So you bring up a really interesting point, and you've always got to weigh those two competing aspects when you're building a game. And it's kind of I can't say that I'm a proficient game designer in that I don't have a lot of experience doing this professionally, but you have, on the one hand, you want to make something that's intuitive, easy to pick up and play in 5 minutes, but on the other hand, you're trying to do what Outer Colony is doing, and that is fundamentally at odds with, like you say, simplicity. Early on in our process, we had to accept that Outer Colony is never going to be Call of Duty. Right. It's never going to be so simple that anyone can pick it up and master it and master its mechanics in 10 minutes. It's never going to happen. But by the same token, we don't want to make something that's so Byzantine that no one can figure it out. Right. So what we've done is we've built in all of these deep mechanics. We've built in all sorts of things, setting propaganda policy, assigning prison guards ships, and there are 150 things that you can do throughout the interface. But we've tried to apply the fundamentals of designing a good user experience, the fundamentals of building good user interfaces into everything we've done in Outer Colony, so that the controls are presented in a straightforward way. Yeah, there's a lot of depth to what they do, but their actual use should be mechanically simple. Yeah. And I think that a lot of the same things apply whether you're designing a user experience for an insurance system or for a game, as far as the controls are concerned. So we try to have really good fundamentals in that regard. And the other thing that we've been doing is we've been trying to get as much real-world testing as humanly possible. And again, I come back to this point a lot, that games are different from from other sorts of software, in the same way that any domain you're working in is going to be different. An insurance system is going to be different from building a radar monitoring system. There are always going to be differences, but games are still fundamentally software. And anytime you introduce a piece of software to an end user, their first go at it, you're going to find out 1,000,001 things that you didn't think of before. So we've gotten testers involved as early as we can, and we've got a lot of feedback. There's a pretty vast text tutorial that leads you through all the steps of getting started out on a website. I'm a person that really loves text, and so for me it worked great. Very few of our users embrace text the way that I do. So a lot of people looked at the text tutorial and they said, I'm lost here, I'm not sure what this is. And there's always the fundamental ambiguity built into text. If you say something, it can be construed in a variety of ways. Whereas if you show something, now you're in business. So one of the key things we got back from our first line of testing with new users was, we've got to make video tutorials. So we've been working on building a comprehensive set of video tutorials that walks you through everything in the game and says, okay, you want to build a structure here. Here's how you select a level terrain tool. Now you drag it. Now
Absolutely.
and that we found has gotten us so much further than anything before. So it's really a process of working with our end users to get to the point where it's as accessible as possible without compromising any of the mechanics.
Yeah, and I can't recommend enough if people are interested in seeing more about what Outer Colony is enough. There's a great tutorial series you have on your YouTube channel. We will have a link to in this video. That is a great place to start. It goes step by step, and in preparing for this interview, that's what I watched, and it was really interesting. So I think that's a great place for people to look. Moving from Outer Colony specifically to more your process as a developer and your history as a developer, you touched a little bit on your background, but I wanted to ask what specifically drew you to indie game development.
I think the biggest thing that drew me to indie game development is just how much it really is the Wild West. You know, you hear all this talk, and you see movies like the Steve Jobs movie.
Yeah.
I haven't seen it, but I know the fundamental premise of it. There's all these stories that kind of paint such a neat picture of these software cowboys of ages past who are doing wild things. But I think something that people don't realize is that the same thing is going on today.
Yeah.
And indie game development is the front lines of a couple of guys and a garage can make amazing, amazing things happen. And I think it's just that complete creative freedom, that ability to drive the project exactly the way that I want to drive it. The opportunity, there's so many great people in the field, freelancers, contractors that are looking for work. You can put together a team of people who are unbelievably talented and absolutely love what they're doing. It's hard to assemble a team as good as what I've got now. If you're working for an insurance outfit that's got a large budget to hire people, it's tough to find people as dedicated and passionate as the ones you can get in indie game development. So there are just so many aspects of the field, from the possibility to create what you want to all the great people you come across that have made it just fantastic. And I sort of knew about those things before, and that's why I really, really wanted to get into it myself.
Awesome. I also like to ask developers what games were kind of seminal in their road towards development themselves. What games, either recently or nostalgically way back when you were younger, defined gaming for you?
I'd say the very biggest one for me, when people ask what kind of pushed me towards Outer Colony, long before I was working in defense, I had as a little kid played Will Wright's Sim Earth on Windows 3.1. And that game was 25 years ahead of its time. I have no idea how they made that stuff work on systems that had 4 megs of RAM, and it's just unbelievable. But when I first played that game, even as a little kid, 7 or 8 years old, I remember it made me think about software in a really different way. Like, wow, they've really modeled a little world inside of a computer, and so many things about it. There are all these processes going on in there that are kind of like the real world. And this is before, the 13th floor or the Matrix kind of popularized these concepts. But I remember thinking about, like, wow, what if you took this to the next level? What if you took it to the next level past that? Could you really model a universe in a comprehensive way? And that is what probably has pushed me on this path as much as anything. A lot of the high fidelity simulation systems that I've worked on are kind of, just the next iteration of Will Wright's Sim Earth. And I almost like to think of Outer Colony as the, 2016, 2017, sure, what that sort of game can be with consumer hardware as it is now. And I know that's way back. I think that game came out in like 1991 or something, but that's probably that. And the other sim games, I really enjoyed City 2000. Those are probably the biggest influencers for me.
Excellent. To bring this to a close, are there any other indie development teams out there or indie games that you think are doing something really innovative, especially that you think people might not have heard of?
Yes, this is one of the other things that's really tough about being an indie developer is there's such a vast sea of indie developers going on, building amazing things out there, but so few people notice most of them. Yeah. There are some guys on Twitter who are doing things that just blow my mind all the time, and I see that they've got like a few dozen followers, and it's like, wow. I'd say Trevor France is a guy to check out. His Twitter handle is Shy Guy. He's
Mm-hmm.
building a game called Pilgrimage of Embers, and he posts a lot of really neat imagery. He's very detailed on his website. You can read all sorts of design things. He's building a very cool game. He's also kind of a master at just sort of teasing you. There's some of the grand things about Pilgrimage of Embers is he's kind of holding them close to his chest, and that makes you. I think he's like the showman that I wish I could be, in that he makes me want to know a lot more. You've covered David Stanley, Skeletac, awesome game, awesome developer. Another guy I wanted to mention was Anachronic Designs. He does mobile games. I met him via Twitter. He's done a lot of very cool stuff, just fun things. There's a game called Flippy Uncle he made. It has hilarious sprites. My car was broken down this summer, and I was stuck sitting in a mechanic's place, and I probably played 5 or 6 hours of Flippy Uncle while waiting. So those are three of the coolest guys I can think of off the top of my head.
Superb. Well, Sam Ruggieri, thank you so much for sharing both your story and a little bit of insight into Outer Colony. There will be links down below and at the end of this video to find out more.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your taking the time to have me on here.